Hello, my name is Renate Heurich.
And I am Toy Carter, and we are members of Extinction Rebellion New Orleans.
This is our talk about the climate and ecological crisis that we are all facing.
We're going to be joined by four other members of Extinction Rebellion New Orleans, including Ben, Kara, Keita, and Penny. Each, in turn, will take on different parts of our presentation today.
About Extinction Rebellion, we are an organization based on the principle of nonviolent direct action and civil protest. We are just ordinary people. I'm a retired teacher, and we have a huge task in front of us. There is collective denial about the extent of the ecological crisis that we are facing. And to really face the truth may start some strong feelings. Besides denial, there may be grief to realize what we are losing and anger about what is being done to our precious earth that we depend on for our survival. We may feel numb or in shock to realize what is going on, but also possibly some relief because there are so many people who are determined to prevent the worst from happening and to fight with all their strength for our survival. So, we're going to look at the truth of what's happening and what we need to do about it. Let's look at the truth first. We are taking information from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, from peer-reviewed research articles, as well as opinions by renowned scientists. And the Climate Reality Project, of which I am a member after doing the training with them. Our Earth is our only life support system, but we are destroying it right now. We are destroying the climate, the ecology, which means we are destroying our future. Let's look at climate first. Here, our atmosphere, a very thin layer that we depend on to provide a livable climate for us. Global heating is working like this. We have solar radiation coming in, passing through our atmosphere. Most of that radiation is absorbed by the Earth and warms it. Some of it is radiated back into space in form of infrared light waves, which can pass through the atmosphere, but some of them are being trapped by the atmosphere, and that's how our Earth is warming. But this is what is happening or has been happening in our atmosphere for the last 150 years. And we have companies are responsible for 71% of global emissions. Sources of those emissions are multiple. Anytime we're burning oil or gas, we emit CO2 into the atmosphere. So that is connected with transportation, with industrial processes, with energy generation, like coal plants burning, also burning of forests or crops. Then we have methane, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas, which is being emitted with the permafrost melting. Also in our industrial agriculture, that is a very energy intensive process. There's methane emitted and also CO2. Landfills emit methane. Fertilization emits nitrous oxide, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas. We are in the process of releasing millions of years of stored energy from these fossil fuels and from coal in a matter of a few decades. That's why we are in such a predicament right now. So, what is happening now? We have more greenhouse gases, so more of the outgoing radiation is being trapped, warming our Earth. And this is going to continue as long as these high greenhouse gas levels are present. Let's look back at the last 800,000 years. CO2 concentrations have fluctuated between 180 and 280 parts per million. When we look at temperatures, they are pretty much in line with the levels of CO2. But where are we today? This is where we are. 415 parts per million. We've never been at that level as long as human beings have been on Earth. And if we continue with our business as usual, this is where we're heading. Just 40 years from now, this would create conditions that are unlivable for most parts of the Earth. So far, our global temperatures have increased by 1 degree Celsius. Here, a baseline from the 1950s to the 1980s of average temperatures. We're looking at cooler than average and warmer than average days, and we see how 10 years into this, it has already begun to shift. We have more warmer than average days. Another 10 years, and this is until 2015. What is really important to note here is that the extreme temperature events that used to cover just 0.1% of the Earth are now covering 14.5%. And extremely hot temperatures are deadly for people. In the US, extreme heat kills more people than any other extreme weather event like floods or fires or hurricanes. And it is getting hotter, especially recently. It's just getting hotter and hotter. And especially up in the northern latitudes around Siberia, their temperatures have increased twice as much as in our area. Try to imagine temperatures 50 degrees hotter than normally on the North Pole. That means we have melting going on in the winter. Also, what happens is that the polar vortex it's split in two because the temperature differences are not as big anymore between the North Pole and the lower latitudes, which combined extremely cold temperatures in Europe and the US with extremely warm temperatures around the North Pole. The enormous warming of the Arctic has led to a plunge in the extent of sea ice. Here you see a graph of the last 1500 years. And we have had these midwinter heat waves now 3 years in a row. Still, most of the extra heat, 93%, is absorbed by our oceans. If our oceans wouldn't absorb 93% of this extra heat, we would be cooking by now. The global ocean heat content has increased massively since just 1960, and half of that increase has occurred in the last 20 years. There is melting going on in areas where we don't even realize. Underneath a glacier, 14 billion tons of ice has melted. And this will lead to sea level rise. Here a look at the projection when we go further out into the year 2300. Usually we only see numbers that end in the year 2100 as if we won't have a civilization after that anymore. This is so short-sighted. Kids who are born today will be alive beyond the year 2100, hopefully. The important point here is that sea level rise is accelerating, and it will accelerate in coming centuries. And the more we curb our carbon emissions today, the less sea levels will rise long into the future. What we're doing today will have a tremendous effect 200 years from now, 300 years from now. The yellow bar illustrates projected sea level rise if we are doing really sharp cuts. Today, this RCP 2.6 scenario would mean drastic cuts on the level that we are having right now under corona conditions year after year. That would keep sea level rise a little bit in check, even over a few centuries. If we do moderate cuts, which is still significant, sea levels would rise according to what you see in this orange bar. And the bright red-orange bar represents business as usual. That's the RCP 8.5 scenario. And those are scenarios set up by the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change. Now, these predictions are very hard to make, especially if you look longer into the future. As you can see in this new slide, in May 2020, there has been a new study published looking at a variety of studies, and they came up with the scenario of 10.8 feet of sea level rise in 2300 under the business as usual scenario. Bottom line is, it is really hard to predict what will happen several centuries from now, but we know that sea level rise is going to accelerate further down the line, and what we're doing today will have an impact, will have a huge impact. Sea level rise is connected with the warming of our Earth, of course, and it really looks like we're heading towards 2 degrees Celsius, in temperature that we haven't seen in 130,000 years. If you look at this graph here, during the Holocene, the last 10, 12,000 years, the climate has been very stable, enabling civilizations to develop. And we haven't seen an Earth 2 degrees warmer for 130,000 years. But we may even reach 4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, especially if we continue with business as usual. We will easily get there by 2100. And that is a temperature we have not seen in several million years. Then when there was no ice in the polar regions, and never in Earth's history has temperature changed that drastically in such a short period of time as today, which also has implications for how species can adapt. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has warned us in October of 2018 that we absolutely have to try to limit global heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius, because the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius is huge. If we want to avoid the worst effects of climate change, we absolutely have to limit global heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But that will require drastic actions, drastically cutting back carbon emissions and also creating spaces that will uptake carbon.
Hello, everybody. This is Penny. I'm going to pick up where Renata left off. And thank you, Renata, for your excellent presentation. So I'll be covering a few different topics: climate lag, feedback loops, and tipping points. So the climate lag idea is basically, even if we stopped emitting all greenhouse gases today, the climate would not immediately revert to what it was. So it actually could take centuries even to stabilize. So in this hypothetical graph, you see a peak, a hypothetical peak of emissions, and as the CO2 emissions go down, eventually carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would stabilize. Even though the emissions have gone down, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere needs to stabilize. So that can take hundreds of years, and the temperature will come down even more slowly, and sea level rise may take even millennia to equilibrate. And remember, sea level rise is due to two phenomena: ice melting as well as thermal expansion. So that's one point, the lags. Now, another really important point is feedback loops. And in science, we talk about positive and negative feedback loops. Here, we're mostly talking about positive feedback loops. And even though it says positive, they're bad. So the idea is that one thing that happens, any particular thing, which we'll talk about shortly, actually reinforces its own conditions. So it actually makes things worse. So there are many of these, and one example is wildfires. So here's a picture of a wildfire, and burning, the simple chemistry of burning is oxidation, and the carbons in the trees, in the wood, is oxidized into carbon dioxide, and it goes up into the atmosphere. And so you can imagine that carbon dioxide is going to increase global warming. So more fire, the fires are actually due to heat, and the more fires you have, then the more carbon dioxide is actually released in the atmosphere. So there actually is a feedback loop. Another feedback loop is due to Arctic ice melting. So the idea here is whiteness. This is a little video. Anything that's white reflects sunlight. Most people are familiar with that. But as the ice caps melt, there's less white surface to reflect, so there's actually more dark surface. So it actually increases the surface temperature, surface and water. So this just depicts that as ice melts from heat, there's less white, so there's more dark water. So that actually increases global temperature. And this is a video, it was sort of apparent previously, but this shows over the years how the northern ice cap, the Arctic ice cap, it has been receding year after year. So this is from 1984 to the present time. The prediction is that the Arctic may become ice-free by 2035. So that's just 15 years away from now. This prediction was actually made several years ago. Now, a third feedback loop is due to the thawing of permafrost. So you've probably heard of permafrost. It's a word for the frozenness of soft land. It would be dirt, soil, which in other latitudes would not be frozen. But in the northern and some the southern Arctic regions, the land itself is frozen. So that's called permafrost. And what you may not have previously appreciated is that within these frozen areas is actually gas that's frozen. And it's mostly methane, but it's also other greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. So what happens, and this is actually a picture of some areas of this extreme thawing. So as global temperatures increase, permafrost thaws, and that releases these greenhouse gases, which causes more. So this is another positive feedback loop, even though the results are negative for us. And there are several examples of this. Sometimes this accumulated gas in the permafrost is so large that as it thaws, it actually explodes. So this is a big crater that was formed by such an event, and there are others as well. And you can see the size of the people compared to the size of the explosion. And here's a prediction from some scientists from 2013 that such explosive release of methane may be apocalyptic. Now, there are many of these positive feedback loops, and what scientists and citizens are concerned about is that if enough of these happen, we will reach a point where there's irreversible change, and that's called a tipping point. And I saw a diagram where there's at least a dozen of these different feedback loop cycles. And scientists are concerned that we've already actually reached some of these feedback loops, and the feedback loops interact with each other, as you can imagine. So these are a list, this is a list of such feedback loops: Arctic ice, Greenland ice sheet, boreal forests, permafrost, the Gulf Stream, Amazon rainforest, warm water corals, West Arctic ice sheet, and parts of East Antarctica. So we don't have time to go into them, but you can be assured that each of these is severe on its own. And because these are interrelated, we're very concerned that we may have crossed some tipping points. Nevertheless, we remain optimistic that as soon as we stop these emissions, we may be able to control some of these outcomes.
Extreme weather events have increased, and that is just since 1980. So the extra heat will evaporate more water from the oceans, and that results in more downpours and flood. But it also pulls more moisture from the land, causing droughts. So we have flooding and droughts as a result of climate change altogether, and both devastating. Here, a picture that shows a rain bomb. When you have all this moisture in the air, it can come down like out of buckets and will cause flooding, like we see here in Baton Rouge in 2016. And there was also a spring flood in 2016 in Louisiana. Hurricane Harvey dumped huge amounts of rain over Houston, the equivalent of 509 days of Niagara Falls emptying into Houston. This is just insane. And as a consequence, we have all these petrochemical installations everywhere, typically located near low income and minority communities. And we see what happens here. You have flooding, this stuff leaks. Petrochemical companies and refineries hurry up to shut down when a storm approaches, which also results in a huge release of emissions. And we all have to breathe that stuff in. People are affected everywhere globally, and people in developing countries have even far fewer means to deal with this onslaught of catastrophes. In the United States, we had an extremely wet period last year. Besides heavier rains and flooding, we're also experiencing more powerful hurricanes. Here, a really powerful example of Cyclone Nargis hit Myanmar in May of 2008 with a death toll of 138,000 people. Hurricane Dorian hit the Bahamas in 2019, utterly devastating this part of the island. And then droughts. Here, a picture of Lake Punjab in Chennai, India in 2018, and 1 year later, the lake is almost completely gone. There are millions of people living in Chennai, depending on this lake for water. And again, well-to-do residents have better means to deal with it, but the poor are really hit hard and have to see how they can even pay for water and then carry it home. In Africa, people are facing food shortages and famine. Here we may face higher food prices. In Africa, people are starving. Here a look at Syria, where wheat fields turned into desert. And they had this enormous drought with a lot of the land turning into desert, driving people into already crowded cities. And the government was just overwhelmed. They were not. Okay, let's look at wildfires. So we see a much longer fire season. These are devastating fires. And the areas are getting larger and larger. that are burning. The Australian wildfires of 2019-2020 were absolutely devastating. Smoke was circling the globe.
In this portion of the talk, I'm going to take you through the truth of the climate crisis, that we are headed ultimately towards extinction. I'm going to tell the truth about our human relationship to this crisis. There are some groups of humans, historically and currently, who bear the most responsibility for this crisis. And there are some groups of humans who've been the most burdened historically and continue to be unjustly most impacted by the climate crisis. These are communities you may often hear referred to as frontline and fence line communities. We'll also talk about the rest of the living world as it is also headed for extinction. The biodiverse ecosystems made of animals, insects, forests, and oceans that we share this planet with, who are unjustly affected by the climate crisis. So, to help us answer the question, how did we get here and who is responsible, this graph shows us who has contributed the most to global carbon emissions in a historic context. Since 1751, the world has emitted over 1.5 trillion tons of carbon. The United States has emitted more carbon than any other country to date, at around 400 billion tons since 1751. It is responsible for 25% of historical emissions. This is twice more than China, the world's second largest national contributor. The 28 countries of the European Union are also a large historical contributor at 22%. Many of the large annual emitters today, such as India and Brazil, are not large contributors in a historical context. This is another representation of that data, where we see cumulatively from 1750 onwards which regions of the world released the most carbon into the atmosphere based on production. Up until 1950, more than half of historical carbon emissions were emitted by Europe. The vast majority of European emissions back then were emitted by the United Kingdom. As the data shows, until 1882, more than half of the world's cumulative emissions came from the UK alone. Over the century which followed, industrialization in the USA rapidly increased its contribution. You'll note that the countries and regions most responsible for cumulative carbon emissions are also contain some of the highest household incomes in the world. So this graphic illustrates the relationship between household income and carbon emissions. It's important to note that as the previous graphs illustrated emissions by country historically, the incomes that represent the richest 10% can exist around the world in a variety of countries. So this report released by Oxfam in 2015 shows that the richest 10% of the world's population produce around half of all emissions. Conversely, the poorest half of the world's population, 3.5 billion people, is responsible for just 1/10 of carbon emissions. When we talk about climate injustice, we're talking about the fact that those who have historically been responsible for carbon emissions and who have benefited from emissions should be held accountable and responsible for those crises. And the struggle to right those wrongs is referred to as climate justice. So how did we get here? To answer this question, we have to look at the interconnected histories of colonization, capitalism, and when we say capitalism, we're talking about industrial capitalism, free market capitalism, and extractivist capitalism. And we have to look at the tendency towards supremacism. And that includes white supremacism, but also human supremacism over nature and male masculine supremacism over the female and feminine. Carbon emissions have been a consequence of quests for power and domination. in these interconnected systems over the past 300 or so years. People who have benefited in terms of power, wealth, and status from these systems tend not to see the harm and suffering occurring. Carbon emissions are a very clear example of that. Indigenous communities have faced genocide, and frontline and fence line communities are already living the daily effects of the climate crisis, while many of us in privileged positions have yet to understand the severity of the world we have helped co-create. During the period of early colonization, Europeans intended to commit genocide against indigenous people through attempts to forcibly remove them from land and to violently disrupt their cultural and spiritual connections to the living ecology of Earth. The map on the left shows overlapping colors that represent the multitude of indigenous languages, cultures, and nations that existed prior to colonization across the land masses we now commonly call North, South, and Central America. The map on the right shows the same territories carved up and colonized by 6 European countries. Where I am at the mouth of the Mississippi River in a city that's commonly known as New Orleans, many of the native people who lived here used this area as a trade port, so to speak. Amongst them were the Oclapisa, the Chata or Choctaw, Achapetula, Achafakti, Chawashi, Bayuk Okla, Natchez, and Chitimacha. And in the region where I'm originally from, what's commonly called the Mississippi Gulf Coast, that was inhabited by the Tunica and Biloxi, Choctaw, and Muskogee. Other languages and nations in this region were Huma, Caddo, Shawasha, Atakapa, Ishak, and many more. It's very important to emphasize that although settler colonialism has been disruptive to indigenous nations' access to tribal lands and cultural practices, many tribes and nations are thriving today, and their leaders are in the forefront of the environmental and climate justice movements. Colonization was committed in the name of supremacy, with different versions emerging to suit the interest of those people in power. At first, it was based on religious supremacy, but quickly became about race and white supremacy as whiteness became a social category associated with Europe and European colonial powers. Capitalism was also growing as a thought system in Europe as the best way to manage the growing wealth being generated from stealing land and enslaving Africans. So as Europeans were colonizing the Americas and building an ideology of white supremacy, they were also fine-tuning their ideas about private property ownership and capitalism. These ideas of supremacy, along with ideas of male supremacy and masculinity, were all imported to colonized territories. In the land we now call the United States, colonizers from a variety of ethnic, religious, linguistic, and cultural groups were encouraged over generations to see themselves as white and as such entitled to private land ownership, and furthermore were socialized to tie their own sense of self-worth to their ability to attain private property. And so whereas previously caste inequality had dominated human societies, a new class inequality began to dominate white populations, where one could earn status and power through acquiring land and wealth. Private property was meaningless if it didn't also produce monetary profit, a key goal and feature of capitalism, and one white colonizers sought to attain through a number of violent practices. Land theft from indigenous nations was normalized, as was exploiting the labor of African slaves and later African American sharecroppers and even factory workers. As settler colonialism extended across the continent, white settlers exploited indigenous Mexican peoples in farming and fishing, and they coerced migrant Chinese and Japanese laborers into grueling and dangerous railroad building in the West. As urban centers industrialized, the capitalist and political elite relied on the exploited labor of those already mentioned, as well as migrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. Over time and through a number of racial projects, these migrants were included in whiteness and held to the same standards of capitalist success as white settlers who came before them. Their ticket into whiteness was to participate in the quest for profit and supremacy, and to keep their mouths shut about injustices they witnessed along the way. These ways of thinking combined are tied to the beginning of excess carbon emissions in our atmosphere. As supremacism, colonialism, and capitalism became the dominant lens through which humans related to the land, land became about monetary profit and power, and accessing and maintaining supremacy. Indigenous people were on the front lines then and continue to be as they fight to protect our planet's ecology today. So let's turn to look at that now. When we are telling the truth about the climate crisis, we have to look at our planet as a living world and our historic relationship to this world. In the next several slides, I'll discuss the climate crisis in this historic context with a focus on forests and high-intensity agriculture. This image shows us how the history of colonization is tied to the destruction of our forests, especially old-growth forests. The old-growth forests, as indigenous people were forcibly removed from land by colonizers, the forests shrunk in size to, in the lower right quadrant, 1990. You can see that there are still some old-growth forests protected in indigenous territories now, but the numbers have shrunk to almost nothing. We have felled 46% of our planet's trees to date. These images were taken from our region in the southeast just over 100 years ago. Our region contained a huge savanna of virgin piney woods, as well as thousands, hundreds of thousands of multi-hundred-year-old cypress trees. The trees were integrated into Native peoples' economies, spiritualities, and families. After Choctaw, Muskogee, Huma, Tunica, Biloxi, and too many other Native peoples, to name here, were forced off the land, and white colonizers were allowed in, and after the Civil War, lumber barons and industrialists from the Northeast began to turn their profit-seeking interests to this region. There was no industrial infrastructure to export huge pine trees, and so the lumber barons built railroads using a system of convict leasing. Remember, this is post-enslavement. Men who had enslaved Africans on agricultural plantations turned more profit off the forced labor extracted from convicts than from the forced labor extracted from enslaved Africans. The convict leasing system was more deadly than slavery, with the rates of death ranging from 15 to 25%. In the history of deforestation of the lands we're inhabiting right now, there is an overlapping history of white supremacy and human supremacy over nature, where land and people were violently exploited in the name of profit and industrial growth, all while releasing carbon into the atmosphere. This pattern of the destruction of forests, the theft of indigenous lives, land and sovereignty, and the super exploitation of human beings continues today. President Bolsonaro of Brazil has given the green light to the destruction of tree cover in the Amazon. You can see in 2017 it was worse than in any other country. The Amazon rainforest is being burned intentionally for logging and to make room for industrial size, high intensity agriculture, which we'll talk more about in a few moments. Indigenous forest defenders in Brazil and worldwide are being murdered. Paulo Paulino Guajara was a forest defender who was murdered by loggers. Global Witness counts in a 10-year period between 2008 and 2018 that 1,427 environmental activists, defenders of land and water, were murdered. Part of the reason rainforests are being cleared and burned in Brazil is for cattle farms. Animals that humans eat, cows, pigs, and chickens, are kept in large numbers in inhumane conditions around the world. But the problems for our environment go beyond clear-cutting forests and inhumane treatment of animals. Factory farming produces a lot of carbon emissions. The United Nations has estimated that 14.5% of human-caused carbon emissions come from the methane produced by cows and other animals as they digest mostly genetically modified feed. Factory farms produce large amounts of animal waste that's largely unregulated and is kept in large open-air pools and allowed to run off into our river systems, estuaries, and lakes. This creates compounding problems for wildlife already attempting to survive the ravages of a rapidly warming world, as well as for frontline and fence-line communities whose groundwater is being poisoned by nearby factory farms. We cannot ignore the overlapping histories of the theft of indigenous land and the forced labor of African Americans, first through enslavement and then through coercive sharecropping systems and convict leasing. There were immense amounts of wealth and power being generated by this violence visited on people and land, and all in the name of profit. High-intensity agriculture uses a great deal of land. Here, rich river delta lands that would have been huge carbon sinks and provided habitat for thousands of water and land animals was replaced with a single monocultural crop. This is an image of the cotton that was harvested by enslaved Africans being sent on barges for export to the cotton mills in the northeast of the United States and to the UK. This system of extracting as much labor for as little cost and extracting as much from the land as possible without attention to the living ecology that it relies on, this system of high intensity and extractive and exploitative agriculture continues to dominate agricultural practices today. Here, migrant laborers in Mexico harvest tomatoes for export. Farm labor globally is intensive and incredibly exploitative labor. Many farm workers are indigenous and are coerced into laboring in a system many activists and human rights observers equate to modern-day slavery. They have left or been displaced from their homelands through a number of mechanisms, including the climate crisis, deforestation, and habitat destruction. Farm workers labor all around the world in wealthy and poor countries for 12 to 15-hour days for very little pay, while sick, without paid leave, and amongst poisonous and cancer-causing insecticides and pesticides. Which leads us to the next point. Large-scale human migration is a regular pattern in the world we inhabit. For centuries, various push and pull factors have contributed to migrants leaving their homelands in search of a better life. As the climate crisis is intensifying, we are seeing and will continue to see large-scale, massive migrations as the land that once sustained human life is no longer able to do so. As we look at the countries on the left side of this list, we see they share common histories. Modern migrations are tied to colonization, supremacism, and neoliberal capitalism, and extractive capitalism, where land is grabbed and entirely used up, such as with fracking and mining. These combined histories of colonialism and neoliberal capitalism have created dynamics where the developing world takes on loans from the overdeveloped world to pay off debts, often dating back to having been colonized, or to fund growth. To receive loans, structural adjustments to the economies are mandated. The cumulative effect of these conditions makes it very difficult for people to sustain life in their ancestral homelands, and migration away from their homelands is one way people adapt to that reality. We have 79.5 million people who were forcibly displaced worldwide at the end of 2019. 80% of the world's displaced are in countries or territories affected by acute food insecurity and malnutrition. Climate change will create the world's largest refugee crisis, as tens of millions of frontline communities are forced from their homes by drought, hurricanes, flooding, and crop failure. More broadly, over 143 million people across sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and South Asia, or around 3% of the regional populations, could be displaced by 2050. That's almost double the number that are displaced by the end of 2019. These mass migrations could intensify fascism, nationalism, and xenophobia, as the entitlements associated with colonialism, supremacism, and capitalism come into sharp relief against the humanitarian needs of more and more humans who are without a homeland. Global heating and rises in humidity may make the lands in orange unlivable. This could displace billions of people from their homelands by 2070. As the planet heats up, plants will no longer thrive. It's that simple. Increased carbon levels alter the protein, vitamin, and micronutrient content of rice grains, causing health consequences, including malnutrition. Other agricultural products will lack vitamins and minerals needed to sustain the lives of those eating impacted produce and grains. Hunger spawns conflict, where direct conflict or migration-related conflict is a compound disaster. So let's now turn to the truth about ecocide, biodiversity, and nature. We have to look to the beings who are also on the front lines of the climate crisis, the animals in the natural world we are sharing this planet with. The world's oceans are now 30% more acidic on average than they were before the Industrial Revolution. Oceans are absorbing most of the extra heat trapped by increased greenhouse gases. The extra energy is warming the oceans, especially the water closest to the surface. This, along with high-intensity farming, which includes fertilizers and pesticides, soil erosion, and large amounts of animal waste and sewage that are all flowing down the Mississippi River. This, combined with warming ocean temperatures, is causing massive dead zones off the coast here in the Gulf South. The result is massive wildlife loss. Here is a fish kill in Plaquemines Parish in 2010. Fish and wildlife cannot survive dead zones. They don't have oxygen in them, and they encourage the growth of deadly algae blooms, which are very toxic for wildlife to swim and live in. These photos were taken by Gene Hall, a shoreboard steward in southern Florida in the winter of 2020-2021. The fish were likely killed by the presence of red tide, which is an algae bloom associated with fertilizers and warming water. What is striking here is the red tide is normally associated with the early spring to late summer months. These animals died in the winter, between December and early January. Populations of marine vertebrae declined 50%, or almost 50% on average, from 1970 to 2012. Climate change, alongside factors like land degradation and habitat loss, is threatening the existence of species all around the world. Experts predict that if the current rate of warming persists, by 2050, 1/4 of all plant and animal species on land will be threatened by extinction. The World Wildlife Federation's report found human activity to be the primary driver of this decline, from overexploiting fisheries and damaging marine habitats to the climate crisis. Animals and microorganisms living in water are not the only ones dying in large numbers. We are driving the natural world to extinction as we replace forests with monocultural crops and huge, dirty factory farms. Of all the mammals on Earth by weight, 96% are livestock and humans. Only 4% are wild mammals. Since 1970, we've lost 60% of the world's wildlife. Today, 1 in 4 mammals, 1 in 8 birds, 1/3 of all amphibians, and 70% of known plants are endangered. 1/3 of insects are endangered, and we have lost 2.5% of insect biomass every year over the last 30 years. These are our pollinators and the creatures that prevent the world from being choked with waste. On the current path, we are headed towards extinction. This path to extinction began over 300 years ago, as the human histories of colonialism, supremacy, and capitalism merged to create what we see as the climate crisis today. But we were already in crisis 300 years ago. And so we have to bear witness to the truth that some amongst us have already faced extinction and have known the climate crisis since its inception 300 years ago. We also have to bear witness to the coming waves of extinction as the earth heats to unlivable condition, as the sea levels rise, and as food becomes harder and harder to grow. There will continue to be climate injustice. Some will continue to benefit from the power and wealth they have amassed, while others will be forced to make decisions out of survival. We only have to look to history to know this future. Okay, let's pause. That was a lot to take in. The scope of the climate crisis and climate injustice is staggering, and the implications for our planet's survival can be overwhelming. As Renata mentioned at the beginning of part 1, this talk may bring up a lot for you: grief, anger, perhaps relief. Let's take a moment to let that all sink in. And now, let's talk about what we need to do. Extinction Rebellion has some ideas that we would like to share with you. So let's start with the obvious solutions and then get into our specific tactics and strategies. We must reduce demand. We have to stop putting carbon into the atmosphere. We have to transition to renewable energy, energy that doesn't revolve around extracting resources from the earth, but that is constant and present already in our earth. We have to build a transportation system that supports safe biking and mass transit. We have to rethink the way we grow our food and support human life and shift to an agricultural system that regenerates soil and supports insects and wildlife rather than depleting soil and pushing insect populations to extinction. And this ties into another important topic. We have to restore ecosystems. Ecosystems that have been destroyed by 300 years of extractive capitalism and supremacism. When we restore ecosystems and engage in regenerative agriculture, we're also supporting systems that pull down carbon from the atmosphere. We can do all this. We have an abundance of resources and labor to accomplish it all. But, and this is a big but, The truth is, those who have benefited the most will not give up their power and wealth or disrupt the systems that have produced their power and wealth. The truth is, none of this will happen without people power. Kita, Kara, and Ben will take you through Extinction Rebellion's strategy for people power and the mass mobilization necessary to tap into our collective strength.
Now that we have gained an awareness about how the Earth's climate and ecosystems are being destroyed, we have a moral obligation to act. We owe it to other living humans who are born into vulnerable positions and whose voice is not as amplified as ours. We owe it to all future humans who have no say in what kind of world they will be born into, for our children, for our grandkids, and for humanity. We owe it to ourselves to rebel against a system that has no cares for our well-being, for our lives, or for our futures. And lastly, we owe it to every single living thing that shares this planet with us, for the animals that keep us company, for those that sustain us, and for the plants that tirelessly clean our air and water. So when you look at the situation like this, the question becomes not, why should we fix this? But how can we not? Now onto strategies. The IPCC, also known as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was established in 1988, and as you can see in this graph, it has had no success in lowering the carbon concentration. And what have we tried to do already? Nationally, there has been numerous approaches to making change happen. There's been political attempts, such as the IPCC. There's been legal attempts, such as trying to keep companies like Formosa from sinking their claws into our communities. There's been campaigning to get better environmental leaders into our government. And there has been the individual actions that we all take to do our part in this fight. But none of this has worked. It clearly has not been enough because carbon emissions have only skyrocketed since the industrial age began. So clearly, we need a new approach. And what is that approach? This is Erica Chenoweth, a professor of public policy at Harvard Kennedy School. She performed a study that revealed that only 3.5% of society needs to be actively mobilized to achieve significant change. And that's great news, because 3.5% is something that you and I can make happen. Just 3.5% of our society mobilized into nonviolent civil disobedience to show our government that we will not be left unheard for any longer. And luckily, we have mentors in history who have paved the path with their successes and struggles in nonviolent civil disobedience. Mentors like Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, John Lewis, and many others who put aside their fears and took a stand for change. They recognized that nothing would change if they didn't protest. They went to marches, sit-ins, gave speeches to crowds. They pulled the public's eye to the change that was coming, whether they liked it or not. And today, we see others imitate these same actions, these same calls for change, calling upon our government to recognize that we need to protect the water that we drink and the land that we walk on in the same way that it does for us. This ties into the Black Lives Matter movement because colored communities are being and will keep being disproportionately affected by climate change if we don't take a stand now. Our primarily white government is not prioritizing the climate crisis because it's not a crisis that will be affecting their privileged communities first. The climate crisis and Black Lives Matter movements go hand in hand because underprivileged communities of color are the first to feel the effects of higher prices on food, water, and energy. They are the communities that get the most polluted by big companies. And to prove a point, as a collective, we have the energy that we need here already. For example, 3.5% of the US population is 11.5 million people. And just within the past 3 months, an estimated 15 million through 26 million people have gone out to the streets to voice our anger for these injustices. We need to keep this same energy going for our intertwined fight against the climate crisis and environmental racism.
Hey, it's Kara here. I'll be joined by Ben, and we're going to talk about how Extinction Rebellion works. So, Extinction Rebellion was formed in October 2018 when British activists, organized by the group Rising Up, assembled in Parliament Square in London to announce a declaration of rebellion against the UK government. Over the following few weeks, 6,000 rebels, as we call ourselves, converged in London to peacefully block 5 major bridges across the Thames River. There were other actions as well, including the planting of trees in the middle of Parliament Square, and rebels even supergluing themselves to the gates of Buckingham Palace as they read a letter to the Queen. The call to rebel against business as usual grew global, and the next week, groups popped up all over Europe and the US. Today, with over 60 US chapters and over 1,000 chapters worldwide, Extinction Rebellion is global and active in 6 continents.
Hey everyone, Ben here. We've met a couple times now, I think. I'm the one whose voice sounds like this. So at this point you might be wondering, what exactly does Extinction Rebellion want to see happen? Well, here in the United States, Extinction Rebellion has 4 demands, and we are organizing to meet these 4 demands. The first of which is tell the truth. We demand that the government must tell the truth about the climate and wider ecological emergency, and must work alongside the media to communicate the urgency for change, including what individuals, communities, and businesses must do. Number 2, act now. We demand that the government must enact legally binding policies to reduce carbon emissions to net zero by 2025 and take further action to remove the excess of atmospheric greenhouse gases. It must cooperate internationally so that the global economy runs on no more than half a planet's worth of resources per year, and it must reverse all policies not in alignment with that position.
The third demand is the creation of a citizens' assembly in the respective country of each chapter. Most governments and politicians worldwide have not taken meaningful action towards carbon neutrality or sustainable climate policies, so we're bringing the power to the people for a safer future. Our fourth demand is a transition to carbon neutrality that prioritizes the most vulnerable people and indigenous sovereignty, establishes reparations and remediation led by and for Black people, indigenous people, people from the global South, and poor people for years of environmental injustice, establishes legal rights for ecosystems to thrive and regenerate in perpetuity, and repairs the ongoing ecocide to prevent extinction of human and all species in order to maintain a livable, just planet for all. Now, why 2025 in particular? Many governments use 2050 as a target for zeroing emissions. And 2050 is comfortably far enough in the future that it lets current governments do basically nothing from an optics standpoint. Waiting that long will be devastating for the climate and for us. By waiting until 2050, imagine you're in a car and you see you're going towards a cliff. Would you say, "Oh, there's a cliff," and keep on driving? No, you would slam on the brakes immediately because your brakes might not work, or they might not be as good as you thought they were, or just because there's no going back from driving off a cliff and you want to live. That's the position we're in at the moment. We are heading towards a climate cliff.
Now, why is our third demand for a citizens' assembly? What is a citizens' assembly? A citizens' assembly is a group of people who are brought together to discuss an issue and reach a conclusion about what they think should happen. So this is a quote from the parliament.uk website and is a fairly broad definition, but it does get to the heart of what a citizens' assembly is all about. Essentially, it is a group of ordinary citizens who have been selected and brought together to consider and discuss at length an issue, and then to make recommendations to the government to take action on that issue. Here in the US, we have quite a few examples of organizations working on citizens' assemblies, some with slight variation, citizens' juries and citizens' initiative reviews being two examples. I would encourage you to look into the work being done by the Jefferson Center in Minneapolis and Healthy Democracy in Portland as two such examples. So, how is a citizens' assembly formed? It turns out it's a pretty structured process. The assembly is a set of people who have been selected on the basis of their demographics to make sure that they're representative of the population. They convene, they hear evidence from experts, experts that they have been offered, but also experts that they have chosen to consult. And they hear from stakeholders, people to whom this issue matters. They also read submissions from the public, so the public have a chance to feed into this process as well. And then they get together and they discuss, in small groups and also collectively, with the evidence and the submissions and everything else, what they think should be done. Finally, they make a formal document that lays out what they think should be done, and they present that to the government, and the government reviews it and implements it. The reason that this is a demand that we have is that it gets around some of those problems of democracy that we mentioned earlier. Democracy in its current form is all too often short-termist. Many politicians work primarily to get reelected, as opposed to working for their constituencies, the people. A citizens' assembly can take the long view because they're not dependent on votes, so they can sit down and they can ask the really hard questions. For example, what is it that we need to do, painful though it may be, to secure a future for our children? And then their work is able to focus and hone in on potential steps to address these long-term questions. They're also free from corporate influences. One of the huge problems with government today is that they rely on very, very wealthy donors, often enormous corporations. They have to keep business happy so that they can get reelected, and that limits to a great extent some of the things that they should be able to do. Particularly, for example, if you want to rein in the fossil fuel industry, which we absolutely need to do. Citizens' assemblies are also representative of the population, and for that reason, they're trusted by the public and perceived to be unbiased. And finally, citizens' assemblies have worked very well in the past on a number of occasions. For example, Ireland called a citizens' assembly to discuss the very, very difficult issue of abortion that it's wrestled with for a long time. And the recommendation that they made, which was to liberalize abortion laws, was then put to a referendum. And the vote of the people was almost identical to the vote of the Citizens' Assembly. So it really was very representative of those people's views. And then that was enacted into law.
So, how does Extinction Rebellion work on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis? First of all, the most important thing to know about Extinction Rebellion is that we are nonviolent. None of our public actions or internal actions or relationships are to be violent in any way. Also, Extinction Rebellion is completely decentralized. As we talked about before, Extinction Rebellion started in the UK and has chapters all over the world, but it is not a hierarchical organization. XR is decentralized and self-organized. What does that mean? Decentralization means that no chapter is in charge of another. Each chapter is an independent entity, allowed to operate officially under the Extinction Rebellion name as long as it follows the principles and demands. Additionally, power is also decentralized within each XR chapter. So, how does it work? Well, each chapter has multiple working groups, such as finance, member integration, action, and more. And each working group creates their own mandate, which outlines their full scope of responsibilities and authority. Working group coordinators attend separate meetings to update the rest of the chapter and to coordinate the groups. However, each meeting, whether it's a working group meeting or a coordinator meeting, is open to everyone else in the chapter, and the minutes of each meeting are accessible to all members. Additionally, the facilitators, note keepers, and timekeepers are rotated for each meeting, and everyone can contribute to the meeting agendas. And when we do have to make decisions, they are made by consensus within each working group and within the chapter as a whole if necessary. Another important thing to know about Extinction Rebellion is that we have what we call a regenerative culture. So each chapter aims to cultivate a regenerative culture both within the chapter itself and in its work with others outside of Extinction Rebellion. At its core, a regenerative culture is healthy, resilient, and adaptable. In this way, it functions like a flourishing ecosystem. Each chapter has a regenerative culture, or regen, working group to help install and maintain a regenerative culture within the chapter. Regen's work can take many forms, including supporting rebels before, during, and after actions, promoting healthy and effective relationships and processes within the chapter and with collaborators, and helping people work with their emotions surrounding the climate crisis. A regenerative culture is anti-racist, anti-oppression, and always growing and evolving.
And our core activities are actions. These are the things that aim to cause disruption and to get us to the notice of the powers that be, but more importantly to the notice of the wider public. The key components of our actions, harkening back to some of the elements of civil resistance we talked about earlier, are that they are nonviolent, disruptive, regenerative, and fun. Some of the actions are conceived and planned locally. For example, a common thing that local groups will do is something called a die-in. You can see the picture on the left-hand side of the screen is a die-in we did in Jackson Square. This is where people will get together in a public space and feign being dead to make a couple points. One, to make the point that what we are looking at is an existential threat to humanity. But also, we included gravestones with ways people have already and are expected to die due to the effects of the climate crisis, to illustrate that this has been happening and continues to happen around the world today. For many people, it is already an existential threat. And then people had to step over us and step around us. They had to interact with this picture, this reality, and come to terms with it. On the right, this is part of an ongoing series of actions we've done outside and recently inside various Chase banks around the city as part of the Stop the Money Pipeline Coalition, drawing attention to how massive financial institutions fund the climate crisis and intersecting systems of injustice. Some actions are conceived and planned internationally. So this was part of a huge global week of rebellion done before Extinction Rebellion New Orleans even existed. And this picture is from central London. And as you can see, they can be, the actions, and we believe they should be, very creative, dragging this huge pink boat into central London and setting up shop for the week. Now, this point here is one of ongoing discussion and evolution, and it's a really important point. We recognize the complexities of participating in an arrestable action, and by no means is it required to participate in Extinction Rebellion or even in Extinction Rebellion actions. This is why it's really important to participate in nonviolent direct action trainings and to prepare and plan as much as possible before participating in an action that might carry a risk of arrest. Furthermore, in Louisiana, as well as in many states around the country, we have a blatantly anti-protest, anti-democratic, quote, critical infrastructure bill. This bill was drafted in 2018 specifically in response and targeting indigenous activists protesting the Bayou Bridge pipeline. Many offenses that used to qualify as misdemeanors are now felony charges. So to that point, we must center the reality that the color of our skin directly influences our relationship to law enforcement. It is imperative, and I cannot stress this enough, that we continue to do the work to engage with systemic and structural racism and actively participate in the processes of undoing these systems, both in ourselves and in society at large. Our actions must continue to evolve accordingly and take this work into account every step of the way. We cannot effectively organize on a large scale or a small scale without doing this work.